The Old West was a land of vastness and freedom, where promises of a new life attracted people from all corners. The endless plains, arid deserts, and towering mountains set the stage for those brave enough to try their luck. Frontier towns began to emerge, small but full of life and dreams, serving as meeting points for immigrants, farmers, miners, and natives, all trying to coexist on the same piece of land. But as with any dream of freedom, there was always the threat of something going wrong. Life in the Old West was tough and often brutal, but for many, it offered a chance for a fresh start. The experienced cowboy, who knew the land better than anyone, rode the old trails, while the newly arrived immigrant looked to the future with hope. The farmer, on the other hand, dreamed of fertile land to plant and prosper. No matter how difficult the journey, the first seeds of growth were being planted. However, there was something in the air, something that threatened to ruin this balance. The territory was vast, and until then there was space for everyone. But as more people arrived to claim land, the peace that seemed possible began to be questioned. The federal government, seeking to establish laws and ensure order, began to intervene more strongly, imposing borders and rules that not everyone accepted. The idea that land was a shared commodity began to fade. The laws were being written to benefit some, and the real question was, who would have the right to call that land their own? Thus a simple spark began to form, with small conflicts arising between farmers and natives. The land that belonged to the natives was being invaded by settlers who felt entitled to expand their properties. The cowboy, once a symbol of freedom, began to feel caught between a rock and a hard place. The promise of land for all began to transform into a silent war for territory and resources. An inevitable conflict was about to erupt, but until that moment, no one truly knew where it would lead. As immigrants spread across these vast lands, the clash of cultures began to take shape. For the natives, these lands were not just a patch of earth to be farmed or exploited. They were sacred, filled with history and traditions that spanned generations. But for the farmers and miners, the land was an opportunity, a chance to prosper and become rich. The newly arrived immigrant, full of hope and dreams, hardly knew that their arrival would be the spark that ignited a fire of conflict. Expansion of frontier towns and the construction of new railways brought with them new tensions. The federal government, determined to control the advancement of settlers and ensure that all followed the new rules, began to implement more aggressive policies. The reservations for the natives were reduced, and lands that were used for hunting and sacred rituals were granted to new settlers. Farmers, on the other hand, were forced to share their land with miners searching for gold, creating more resentment. The sense that the natives were being forced to disappear fueled a growing sense of injustice and revolt. At the same time, the experienced cowboy, who once freely roamed the vast plains, found himself now pressured to take sides. Many of them, who once lived from hunting and herding, began to realize that the price of peace was too high. The government's promises of a peaceful Old West seemed more distant, and those seeking freedom began to see that their own freedom was being taken away. The war for the land was no longer just in words, but it was beginning to reflect in the actions of each group. Meanwhile, the immigrants, driven by the search for a better life, began to realize that their new home was not as welcoming as they had imagined. caught in territorial disputes and forced to defend their land rights. Many of them faced the same challenges the natives had, only to be seen as enemies by those who had long called that land their own. Chaos was being planted, and soon it would no longer be possible to distinguish who was the enemy and who was the ally. The spark for war was inevitable. After years of growing tension, the forced coexistence between farmers, immigrants, and natives reached its breaking point. Disputes over land and resources became more intense and more violent. On a hot summer morning in a thriving frontier town, an isolated scuffle between a farmer and a group of natives quickly escalated into an armed confrontation. The violence, which had been contained until then, exploded without warning, spreading like an uncontrollable fire. The town, once a place of trade and coexistence, turned into a battlefield. The experienced cowboy, who had always believed in possible peace, now found himself in a moral dilemma. Stand with the natives who knew the land, or with the farmers who had fought for it. The war over territory took on a new dimension when the town was divided, with barricades being erected, and residents forced to choose a side. The issue of land ownership, which was once merely a commercial dispute, became a war for survival. The presence of the federal government, which had previously tried to mediate the conflict, became a catalyst. Troops were sent to restore order, but they only exacerbated the violence. The natives, who saw their lands being taken ruthlessly, began organizing to resist the advance of settlers. Meanwhile, the farmer, who had believed he was fighting for a just cause, saw his property surrounded by forces he could neither control nor deny. Immigrants, often caught in the middle, were dragged into the conflict, forced to choose sides to ensure their survival. This first great conflict not only sparked the war, but also forever divided the region. Alliances that once seemed possible disintegrated, and the concept of the Old West began to change. What was once a land of opportunity for some had now become a bloody battlefield, where freedom was replaced by the fierce struggle for land. Each step taken toward survival only deepened the chasm that separated the different groups. From that moment on, there was no turning back. The war for the frontier had been declared. As the conflict intensified, the lines of battle became more than just territorial boundaries. The land was divided physically, but also psychologically, creating invisible barriers between the different groups. The farmer, who had once shared his dreams with the immigrants, now saw those same immigrants as a direct threat to his livelihood. The frontier towns, which had once been symbols of coexistence, turned into fortresses where each side defended itself with everything it had. The borders began to be drawn in the minds of the people, becoming as real as the fences and walls that divided them. The experienced cowboy, who had known the freedom of the open plains, now found himself confined to a world of impossible choices. Each decision he made pulled him further from the land he loved and the life he knew. At the same time, the immigrant, who had once seen the land as a promise of a new life, now began to realize that this promise came at too high a price. The border was no longer just a line on the map, but a line that separated who could thrive and who would be left behind. Tensions between the natives and settlers erupted with every new piece of land taken, and violence became more frequent, with attacks at night and ambush during the day. Meanwhile, the natives, who had always lived in harmony with the land, now found themselves forced to fight for their survival. The lands that had been theirs for generations were being occupied by people who did not even understand the spiritual value of the land. The native leader who had tried to negotiate peace now found himself forced to choose between protecting his people and preserving the honor of his culture, or succumbing to the pressure of colonial expansion. The land was divided not only by the force of arms, but by the force of ideologies and beliefs, creating an irreparable rift between the old inhabitants and the new invaders. The federal government, in its attempt to bring order to the chaos, did nothing but deepen the divisions. The new laws, which were supposed to guarantee peace, seemed more like an imposition that disregarded the traditions and rights of those who had been on the land for centuries. The cowboy, who once believed in the idea of a free frontier, now saw that his freedom was being taken away in the name of a system that did not understand the reality of the Old West. From this point on, the borders were not only geographical, but moral, social, and cultural, creating a divide that would be hard to heal. What began as a series of isolated skirmishes quickly escalated into an all-out war, with battles happening daily along the divided borders. The towns, once peaceful, became war zones. Streets that had once been calm were now filled with bandits, soldiers, and guerrillas, all vying for control of strategic points. Each group fought not only for land but for their very survival, with violence spreading everywhere, turning the Old West into a scene of chaos and destruction. The cowboy, once a symbol of freedom, now found himself leading small resistance groups. Those who had once believed in a peaceful and prosperous Old West now found themselves forced to make tough choices, where morality and survival instincts collided. The war became more impersonal, with coordinated attacks, ambushes, and murders. Alliances changed constantly, and loyalty was no longer a given. The cowboy and the farmers who had once been considered friends now found themselves on opposite sides of a bloody conflict, with the line between right and wrong blurred. The natives, who initially resisted the expansion with small skirmishes, began organizing bolder and more coordinated attacks, challenging the growing military presence and the invasion of their land. The fight for survival transformed into a fight for dignity and the preservation of a culture that was being erased. Their leaders, who had once tried to negotiate a peaceful exit, now found themselves forced to adopt guerrilla tactics, attacking supply routes and colonies in a desperate effort to ensure that their land, traditions, and families were preserved. The federal government, unable to control the violence, sent more troops, more weapons, and more resources. But each attack, each retaliation only fueled the hatred further. The war was no longer a land dispute. It was a fight for the identity of a nation. The Old West, which had once been a land of opportunity and freedom, had transformed into a battlefield where each group fought to assert their supremacy. What little order or patience remained disappeared with each new clash. The war in all its fury was now in full force. As the conflict progressed, the towns and villages that once thrived began to disintegrate, giving way to ruins and desolation. The war spared no one, and loss became a constant. Families who had once arrived with hope now found themselves forced to flee or fight for survival. The experienced cowboy, who once had control over the vast lands of the West, saw his life turn into a series of endless battles. The freedom he once enjoyed was replaced by an invisible prison of broken loyalties and an uncertain fate. The immigrant, who had arrived with dreams of prosperity, now felt the weight of his choice. Many, once willing to fight for the land they believed was theirs, began to question whether the price of victory was worth it. The small disputes that once seemed insignificant had now become deep wounds, hard to heal. The farmers who had built their properties with such effort watched as their homes and lands were burned or taken by force, and the pain of loss was stronger than any hope for reconciliation. On the native side, the pain was equally immense. The lands, once home to their ancestors, were being stripped away mercilessly. The native leader, who had been a symbol of resistance and wisdom, now found himself consumed by tragedy. The fight for survival was no longer about defending a territory, but about preserving the dignity and values of a culture threatened with extinction. The idea of a peace that once seemed possible now felt like a distant illusion, left behind by an endless war. Despair spread like poison, infecting all sides of the conflict. The war, which had begun with an ideal of freedom, had now become an endless cycle of loss. And amid the destruction, one fundamental question emerged. How far would men go to secure their land, their culture, and their survival? The breaking point was in sight, and the effects of this war, both physical and emotional, would be felt for generations. The war had reached its peak. The forces clashing were increasingly weary, but the determination on both sides had never been stronger. The Old West, now a bloody battlefield, saw its final great battle form on the banks of a river. This river, which had once symbolized the tranquility of the region, had now become the front line of a decisive confrontation. The battle that would determine the future of the West was about to take place, and all were aware that what happened here would forever change the landscape and the lives of those involved. The cowboy, once a man of free spirit, had now become a leader, guiding a group of desperate warriors. He knew this would be their last chance to secure a future for those who still believed in the freedom of the West. But he also knew that the war would leave deep scars, not only on the land, but in the hearts of the survivors. The natives, led by their chief, were ready to do whatever it took to protect their culture and their land. It was a clash between two worlds that could no longer coexist. And now on the battlefield, one would have to fall. The tension in the air was palpable. The sound of heavy boots pounding the earth and the murmur of troops preparing for the confrontation filled the air. The daylight began to fade, giving way to the dark cloak of night. But the glow of flames reflected in the eyes of the fighters illuminated the determination in each of them. Neither side was willing to retreat. The final battle, therefore, was more than just a fight for territory. It was a fight for identity itself. Whoever won here would not only control the land, but also determine what remained of the history of the Old West. On the night before the battle, many began to reflect on what had been lost up to that point. The cowboy thought of his old days, of freedom on the plains, far from the violence that now dominated his life. The native leader thought of his ancestors, who had lived peacefully on this land for generations. Both knew that there was no turning back. The war had taken everything they had known, and now all that remained was to fight until the end. The dawn would bring a bloody battle, but it would also reveal the true face of destruction, loss, and an uncertain future. With the final confrontation now over, the Old West, as everyone had known it, was destroyed forever. The battle that had promised to be the last great war left a trail of destruction and immeasurable loss. The survivors, now marked by the scars of war, looked out over the devastated land and wondered what remained of the promise of freedom and prosperity that the West had once offered. The cowboy, who had once roamed freely across the plains, now found himself forced to adapt to the new order that had risen from the ashes of war. For the natives, the loss was irreparable. Those who still remained fought bravely, but watched as their culture and lands faded before their eyes. The native leader, who had once held hopes for peaceful coexistence, now found himself as a guardian of the last traditions of his people, trying to keep alive the memory of their heritage amid the chaos. The land that had once been theirs was now divided and reconfigured, and the natives were largely forced into reservations or vanished from history. The immigrants, who had come with promises of a better life, found themselves again in a land where the dream of prosperity had turned into a nightmare. Some had lost everything: their homes, their families, their hopes. Others, the more resilient ones, tried to rebuild their lives in the new conditions that had emerged. But even among the survivors, there was a sense that nothing would ever be the same. The Old West, with its spirit of freedom and adventure, had become a place marked by division and violence. The war for land, culture, and identity had consumed everyone, and what remained was no longer the promising West it once had been. But for those who were still standing, the question remained: what now? Peace had finally arrived, but it was not the peace everyone had dreamed of. It was a forced peace born of destruction, pain, and loss. And as the cowboy gazed toward the horizon, he knew that the West would never be the same. He knew that with the war's end, the true battle for the identity of the Old West was only just beginning.